Hello, my name is Candace Prince. I'm with Green Hope Project. We have Rob Rohrbaugh with us this evening. We're very excited to have him. He's going to talk to us about Borderland Geology, Energy-Water Nexus. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Rob.
All right, well, thanks for joining in. I'm teaching at EPCC and do special grant programs with UTEP. I'm actually a native El Pasoan. I'm 49 years old, so I was born here, moved back from San Francisco after several years. I'm back in the desert. And the one thing we have to recognize, it's called the Borderland for a reason. We have a lot of different communities, but our climate is pretty much the same, and we live in a desert climate, yet water is typically not everyone's mind as the top focus, yet every second of every day demands water in many fashions. And what sets the stage for this is actually the geology. All your electricity, all the electronic devices, like what we're using for this session, all hinges on water, and the geology sets the stage for every drop of water. When we tend to look at these components individually, they're kind of interesting, but we don't really understand the full scope of how they're really interdependent on each other. And without the geology, we literally could not live in this region, in this borderland region. And so we're going to look at how both our population is dictated by the geology and therefore our energy and our water components. So let's hope my slide moves forward here. There we go. So as you can tell, and looking at this map, our communities and this picture in the lower left here with our historical nature, we go with the flow, literally. Without rivers, our historical communities could not exist. El Paso is called the Pass for a reason, because the river passes between the Sierra de Juarez Mountains and the Franklins, and it's that river. And as you look in the map here, all your primary communities, Las Cruces, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, all the way up into Colorado where the Rio Grande starts, and I drive by this almost every winter, the mouth of the Rio Grande. Without that river valley and flow, none of these communities could exist all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So we established that dependency on water, but lots of times what we think our dependency on is much more limited than the full scope. And so when we look at the population of the Borderland region since 2013, it's growing at such a rapid rate. El Paso's averaging 13,000 people per year. And here it is 2020, and you can see over here, we're roughly about 930,000 people already, and it's actually closer to 1 million. It's growing, and that's not including the 70,000 Fort Bliss soldiers and families tied with that. So if we just look at the growth per year in population, just 10,000 people alone in El Paso requires 1.3 million gallons more per day to meet that 10,000 people. And we're already exceeding that amount per year that we're adding. And then you look at Juarez, they're actually increasing 30,000 per year. So they're almost triple of what El Paso is. And yet, if you look at the border migration that's been going on in the last few years, especially the last few months, it's actually higher than that. So our population is a significant factor in our water and energy needs, and how to meet that is the biggest challenge that we're dealing with. But if we go back to the source of all this flow, this is where the geology starts to set the stage. And it's these high mountain caps here up in south central Colorado, the San Juan Mountains. If it wasn't for the geology creating that, which I'll show you a picture of next, if you didn't have those high mountains to capture the winter snow, then you wouldn't have the melt, and then the melt wouldn't be able to feed the river valleys. So it takes the mountains hundreds of miles to the north to determine our river flow. And the way that was formed is what we call flat subduction. It's a tectonic process where the oceanic crust is literally pushed under the continental crust. And literally, it's like, imagine a car crashing into a wall, it crumples up. And if you can see here, these red blobs coming up, and this black line is an actual major fault line. If you ever go to Denver, Denver's on the flat side primarily, and then you have the big mountains popping up just to the west of Denver. And that's because of this process that has literally squeezed and pushed the mountains up high enough so that they can capture all that winter moisture, collect the snow, and then when the snow melts, it then melts off into the Rio Grande Valley. But that's just the first stage of the geologic process of building the mountains up. Then making the river valley is the second stage. So first we went from squeezing to now stretching, which is called rifting. And so this diagram here shows you a simplified version of the Rio Grande Valley, kind of all the way through from South Central Colorado, all the way through to El Paso into Mexico. And so if you think of taffy and you stretch it, it thins out. And that's exactly what's happened all the way through central New Mexico. Central New Mexico is stretching apart on average about 1 inch every 10 years. So in my lifetime, New Mexico, central New Mexico has expanded 4.9 inches. So you can make the calculation on how old I am based on that one for all you mathematical minds. What we see here though is the Rio Grande River passing through. These black lines are actually fault lines. As we stretch the area, it literally sinks, creates a valley. And if you're ever driving up through Albuquerque, Santa Fe, there's a lot of extinct lava flows because these narrow, thin valleys in these faults allowed hot magma to come up and then spread along the surface as lava. So when you see those black mesas off of I-25, those are a consequence of the stretching process. But without that stretching process, we could not have our river valley. So without a river valley to capture that melted snow, you're not going to have any water source for all those communities coming all the way down here to El Paso. So when we look at El Paso specifically and the Hueco Bolson, our dominant source for water right now, as we speak, is coming from underground. The river has not flowed since mid-September. So we've been getting all of our water from underground. And in this yellow zone here, this is basically like cutting through a cake, what we call a cross section. And we are looking at the subsurface up to over 9,000 feet down. This yellow zone here, if you can see it, the thickest part, that's 9,000 feet thick. And out of that 9,000 feet, 8,000 of it, actually 8,500 is filled with water, but it's not necessarily all the water that we can use. But what we have are these black lines that are fault lines. So El Paso is actually a very earthquake prone area, just not like California where you see it daily, weekly, monthly. We're on more of a time scale of decades to centuries that we have a major earthquake, and we're actually overdue for one. But without the earthquakes coming from these faults, we could not literally have a water supply right now as we speak. We could not live and function in this area. And so that's the key thing I'm trying to help everyone understand is these geologic factors literally provide the water resource that we need to thrive in this area. And then we'll get into the energy correlation on that. So if you ever have thought about geology and thought, oh, it's just about a bunch of stupid rocks and all that, because that's what everyone thinks of when they come to my class. We don't even look at rocks when I'm teaching a course until 3 months in. We actually start with water because everyone can relate to water, especially if you're taking a shower first thing in the day, or if you like your toilet and you like not having to go outside and fertilize the bushes. That's what it's all key on. The geology sets the stage, and it's this yellow zone in this diagram and these faults that allow us to live in this region. When we commonly think of how we demand water, here's kind of a nice breakdown of a national survey of how things work. I'm sure most everyone would probably think shower is the most dominant water demand for our daily needs, but that's only second to toilet. Your toilet is actually the most consuming water. Every time you flush, you know, you're using actually fresh water, unless you're at my house where I use recycled water for toilet. I've never had anyone tell me they're cooking or drinking out of their toilet, other than their dog maybe doing that. But we are using fresh water for our toilets when you can be using recycled water that is just as odorless, just as clear, and you can save a lot of water and on your water bill, depending on how big your family is. Another one that I want to point out though is leaks. Leaks are roughly 12% of our water loss. So here in the desert, anything that's leaking, not only does it part of it go into the ground, a lot of it just evaporates into the air. And you pour water out on a sidewalk in the sun on an 80-degree day, that water will evaporate in 30 minutes. So we lose about 30% of all exposed water per hour that it's exposed because of our dryness. So this gives you an idea of how our typical consumption is, but that's only a small part of the picture. There's so much more. One of our icons here in El Paso is the star. I have really good feelings about the star most of the time, but there's a dark reality, as I like to say, to the star. And it is our icon, and it's awesome. I love the pictures. This picture really kind of sets the stage with the sunset and everything, the star that it used to only be on in the holidays, but now it's on every night, and it's on every night for 5 hours. It has 459 of the CFL bulbs, not the LEDs, as of last checked within the last year. Those are the coiled ones. They're also the ones that are filled with mercury, so when they break, they release a lot of mercury, and that's a whole nother issue there that we won't get into. But 20 watts each 20-watt bulb burns half a gallon of water per hour. So think of a gallon-sized milk jug in your mind and cut that in half, and in 1 hour, just one of those 459 bulbs uses that much water. So if you take all that and multiply it, a half a gallon times 459, okay, you're going to get 230 gallons per hour. And that star runs for 5 hours. You're going to be using, we as a community, for that nice iconic symbol, we are using 1,150 gallons per night. In 1 month, that's 34,000 gallons. In 1 year, that's 414,000. If you want to put it into the context of your house, if you have any of the old style light bulbs, a 40-watt bulb, that's 1 whole gallon of water in 1 hour. So to understand, that's the correlation of electricity and water. And you're probably still wondering, well, how does electricity need water? I was told never to put the hairdryer near the shower or the bathtub because I get electrocuted. How can water and electricity be associated with it? We got to start to think kind of like a radiator in your car. And before we get to the visual on that, just to give you a perspective of a typical household in 1 month uses 30,000 gallons per month just to power the electricity in your house. And this is what helps you understand the water correlation. This is steam coming off here, and this is the Rio Grande plant. This is the original one over by Cristo Rey, Sunland Park area. And on a cold morning, this was taken in November 2 or 3 years ago while I was doing some field work over there. And when it's cold enough, the steam just is really, really visible. And that's going constantly all the time. that steam is coming off the generators that spin with the giant magnets to create the electricity flow. Well, to spin those motors, you have to keep, spin those generators, your motor has to be kept cool, just like a radiator in your car. The difference with a car is the water is a closed loop. It just recirculates through the radiator and the motor. But with our power generating plants, it's not a closed loop. They run the water through, and when it gets really hot, it steams off. And then the rest of the water that doesn't steam off gets recirculated back in. But they have to keep replacing the water that steams off to keep those generators from overheating. So that's how we get the water consumption tied to our electrical production. So you can't have water without electricity, as we'll find out here where we're pumping out of the ground, and you can't have electricity without the water, and then none of this would exist if it wasn't for the river valley and the basins. So they're all directly connected. So you can't, there's the nice video of it moving there. I wasn't sure if that was going to work. Real short. So how do we get the water to our locations, our households, our community, throughout our community? Well, that takes electricity and to power the pumps. So here's some heavy duty pumps right here that we see in the diagram, these purple pumps, and those feed then the water tanks we see scattered all across the community, the borderland. And then we have these huts right here that are actually extracting the water, and there's a pump within there out of the underground. So right now, these pumps are key for getting the water underground, which I'll show you those factors and how prevalent that is. If we just look at a 1 horsepower motor, which is tiny, okay, 1 horsepower motor is pretty small. It uses 746 watts per hour. Think of the light bulb. A 40-watt light bulb uses 1 gallon of water per hour. So a 1 horsepower motor uses 18 gallons per hour. A 10 horsepower then uses 180. These pumps are much bigger than 10 horsepower. I don't know the exact number, but they're a lot bigger. And so we can already see how many pumps there are in this picture, and you start just multiplying it. So essentially a safe conservative number of how much power is used just to get the water to us, 10% of our water is lost just to pump the water into the tanks, which then is gravity fed from the tanks to our households, our business, and so on. So typically El Paso has, on a normal day, is about 100 million gallons per day total demand, okay? So on that day, to get that, meet that 100 million gallon demand, you're gonna lose 10 million gallons just pumping the water. In the middle of the summer, they peak out at about 160 million gallons on a hot summer day, especially when people are watering their grass and all that. We should be using actually recycled water for grass. That actually is better for the grass and the plants, more nutrients. But we're using fresh water, but to get that fresh water wherever it needs to go, 10%, that's 16 million gallons on one of those peak days. So just getting the water to us costs us water. It's kind of like you need money to make money. Here's an overview of a typical portfolio of water. And typically when we think of our water demand, we think of the blue zone, which is 12%. That's public supply. That's us in our households. Another common one to think of that's large is irrigation, especially for farming, but that's only 32%. The dominant amount in this red zone, almost half, is for creating electricity, thermoelectric power. So half of our water consumption is just tied to electricity and pumping it to our households. So that puts things kind of into a perspective of how we demand our water. Now, one thing you may not have thought of is gasoline. and diesel to process your gasoline for your car or diesel for a lot of the big trucks. It takes at least 1 gallon up to 2. So diesel requires less processing. So diesel is more on the 1 gallon end of the spectrum, but gasoline requires a lot of processing. And so up to 2 gallons of water per gallon of gasoline. And we have Western Refinery here in the Borderland. And so for them to process those fuels, they have to use 1 to 2 gallons depending on what they're processing. So every time you drive your car, every time you go fill up your tank, think about how many gallons you're putting in gas, where you're putting the same amount or double the amount of water that you've consumed, demanding that. So what you drive, I have a hybrid car. I get almost 60 miles per gallon, a Kia Niro, and I get 80 mile commute that I normally do round trip. I'm luckily only using a little over a gallon, where if my other vehicles, my old style, it would be 4 to 5 times that. So how much we drive plays a factor in how much water we're demanding locally based on Western Refinery. So they pull both from the EPW supply, El Paso Water Utilities, and they do have their own wells. I have a friend that I mountain bike with, and he actually knows about all those wells. I don't know how many in the ratio, but they need those wells because they can't always rely on the main supply in case it's being stressed. And so they have to be able to compensate. So just driving alone, you need the energy for the car, but you also need the water. So where do we get our water from in terms of the range of supply options? Living in a desert, you know, we're very limited. We can't rely on rain. Well, most everyone, when I ask the question, where's our water come from? First thing they think of is the river. That's the most common. However, what most people don't realize is that, especially right now, because the river only typically runs it's supposed to be released here, I think, any week now, early June. Usually it's running by late March. And the last few years, that has not been the case. And so we have to rely on the Waco wells and over in the Mesilla Basin. And when you combine those two together, you're looking at almost 60% of the supply comes from underground. And then we have the desalination plant, which also pulls water from underground, but has to clean up the water that's too salty, which I'll point out here in another cross section. So we've been trying to rely on the river more because of concerns with the underground factor, but the river is not cooperating with the recent climate shifts that I'll be able to point out here soon. So if we look at, and see if I can get this out of the way here. If we look at this picture of Elephant Butte, which is basically our main reservoir that contains the water before south of Albuquerque. In 1994, I was actually going to Elephant Butte a lot in the 90s. Wanted to go more in the 2000s, but in the 90s, it was full and over the spillway most of the 90s. But in 2013, which was one of the worst years, and there's also been another bad year in 2017, 2018, almost no water. No water in the lake means no water in the river. And so we're going from one extreme of too much water in the 90s to very little, especially since 2000. I can show you the graph that represents that. And so in this graph, this is the water volumes in Elephant Butte since the 1920s. And now one of the things, we talk a lot about climate change. From a geologic perspective, we have to recognize that climate change is the oldest story in the world. It's been going on forever. The question or the debate is, how much are we playing a role in making it happen faster and more intensified? If you look at this diagram here, Elephant Butte, we had really wet years from the 20s through the 40s, but it would roller coaster quite a bit. And then we had some dry years, especially in the 50s, some small spikes in between, but definitely the 50s, 60s, and 70s were pretty dry. And then we hit the 80s and 90s, and this was my heyday at Elephant Butte. We had the most water ever in the 80s and 90s on record that we've been keeping. And then when 2000 hit, I noticed, without even knowing any of the data, and this was before I was really heavy into geology and tracking all this stuff, I noticed around the 2000s, everything was going dry. We didn't have hardly any snow in the winter up in Ruidoso, Ski Apache area, and then the lake was always just low. And it's been that way for basically the last 20 years solid. And so if we look at these cycles, the question is, we had our wettest 20 years in the 80s and 90s, and then it went dry. The question is, are we going to be coming out of this cycle? Is it going to be a 20-year cycle that we get to come out of, or is it going to extend longer? And that's a matter of trying to be a fortune teller right there. But we have to be prepared for the worst case scenario, especially in terms of our supply and our sustainability. What I'm going to point out here in a future graph in terms of demand is in 1989, actually the water utilities became very concerned about our underground water supply, but yet the 80s and 90s were our wettest years ever. Why would we be concerned about water supply in our wettest 20-year cycle? So that's something to keep in mind. In terms of where we get this water from underground, here we have our red hashtags, Twitter tags. This was pre-Twitter days. This is an outdated diagram. There's far more of these all over the Waco boson. There's a lot going along Loop 375 here. And so we have closer to 200 wells in this part of the Waco boson all across. And then we have about 25 wells over here in the Mesilla Basin. We cannot expand much at Mesilla because there is arsenic in the groundwater, naturally forming arsenic from the lava rock called basalt. So that's very expensive to extract. They do that right now, but it's really not cost effective to expand on that. So we're limited more to the Waco boson. And then we have these two big green hashtags here right along the river, and that's where we pull in our river water supply when it's running, and they clean it and treat it to send it to your house and the businesses. So this kind of gives you an idea of the distribution for underground and surface water extraction. Now, when we look back into the Waco boson, this is a diagram from the El Paso water utility site that I reference a lot. What we have is we have 3 zones of water in that 9,000 foot deep basin. So this deepest point here, right along the eastern edge of the Franklins, where we have these fault lines. So if it wasn't for these faults, we wouldn't have this reservoir, underground reservoir, like a sponge to hold this water. The problem is the dominant zone, zone 1, that's our fresh water. Zone 2 is our brackish water. That's what the desal plant, the K. Bailey Hutchison desal plant off Global Reach in Montana, they're extracting water from there and then using reverse osmosis to separate all the salts and minerals to make it fresh. But zone 2 is very thin. So our desalinization option doesn't give us a whole lot more in the overall scope. Zone 3 is unattainable. It's not even feasible to extract from zone 3. So you're looking at 1,000 feet of available water out of 9,000 that we can work with. So we have a very limited supply in the underground. And to get that water in there, the age of that water that was dated by the USGS in 2003 ranges from 12,000 to 25,000 years. So that's a long time to get that water in there. And by the way, the Rio Grande used to flow through the Waco Basin, east of the Franklins, used to cut across the Anthony Gap area. But then as things shifted, tectonic forces, and that's a long story that I can get into separately, but that's how a lot of our water came from, was when the Rio Grande was flowing on the east side of the Franklins, and that's not happening right now. And we're just pumping it out like a Slurpee on steroids. So these three zones are key. So understanding the depths and the availability is important to understanding our long-term sustainability options. If we look at this diagram to show Juarez relative to El Paso, we can't just focus on El Paso because we're actually sharing the same system, and Juarez gets all their water from underground. They don't do any surface water extraction yet, at least. Maybe they will, but why are you going to rely on something that is only part of the year and build all that infrastructure? So it's not necessarily the most cost effective for them probably at this stage. If we look at El Paso and how much we take out every year annually on average, on a wet year, we'll take out 40,000 acre feet. And you're probably wondering what an acre foot is. Picture a football field in your mind and a foot deep of water. That's an acre foot, because a football field is basically an acre. So when the river is running strong and long, we only take out 40,000 football fields from underground. But in the dry months, we'll take up to 80,000 football fields from underground. But look at Juarez, 100,000 football fields, and it's probably gone up since then. So that's probably outdated data right there. And so when you combine the two, between Juarez and El Paso, we have 140 to 180,000 football fields. And so in this diagram, you can see the red zone over here. The water levels have actually dropped right along kind of the Chamizal area between El Paso and Juarez. Water levels in underground have dropped 200 feet since the 1950s. If you put this into perspective of like a bank account, we're taking out water underground, just like spending money, but we're always trying to earn money, and so to put the money back into your bank account, well, what we call recharge, we're trying to get water back into the underground, but it's not working too well because based on estimates of research, at best, we're only putting back in 35,000 football fields or acre feet back into the ground, and that's on wet years. That doesn't include the drought years. So if you put that into perspective of how your bank account would work, you'd be spending 5 to 8 times of what you earn. So our seasonal recharge is not very good. And we have our drop that I mentioned earlier, 200 feet. So imagine if you were going around spending 5 to 8 times what you earn, what would be your financial status in a year or so? Even if you won $1 million in the lottery, how long would that $1 million last based on your current income if you're spending 5 to 8 times of what you're earning? So that's how we have to look at our water demand. Water is a very challenging factor, and El Paso Water Utilities has a lot stacked against them. As dire as this can seem at times, you also got to understand they are meeting a demand. And so they're just trying to meet what you guys turn the faucet on for and turn the electricity on for. And so they're kind of at a very rock and a hard place, as I like to say. We're trying to meet that demand. So the main solution is us, not them. If we think of pumping water out of the ground, think of a sponge. When you wash your dishes, that sponge is fat when it's full of water. But if you let it sit and dry overnight, it shrinks. And what happens when it shrinks is it literally pulls things apart. So when we look at basin fill, all the dirt and stuff in this 9,000 foot, think of a giant sponge. When you dry it out, it shrinks on a massive scale. And then the basin literally starts to sink, what we call subsidence. And it can actually induce earthquakes. Those faults that I showed you in the other diagram, I'll show you a surface version here shortly. It can induce those faults to move, causing an earthquake, because when the sponge shrinks, the faults lose friction and literally slip past each other. And then we have surface fissures, which I had a cool diagram picture up here, but somehow it disappeared with the visual. Giant cracks literally form the ground that break up all your infrastructure, can crack highways in half, cause the overpasses to fall down, so on and so forth, all the damage. So all the stuff, the airport is in Waco Boson, and most of the wells surround the airport. Well, you can have something suddenly crack and people are coming in landing on an airplane, and that's going to cause a plane crash on the landing. So the more we pump out of the ground, like we're already been doing and are currently doing, we open the door for the ground to literally pull apart, because it's shrinking in certain spots just like a sponge does. So it's not just about the water supply, it's about potential damage to our infrastructure. The new William Beaumont Hospital, right off of Spur 601 and Loop 375, it's already sinking. And that's a combination of factors of not relying on geologists like me to tell you what to expect, because the engineers think they can build everything just right. Well, you can, but if you're building in the wrong spot in the wrong way, it's going to cost you. And that's already been a major overrun project, and it's probably going to have more problems. So oh, there's the picture. Now it came up. So there's the giant crack that formed in Arizona because of the surrounding agriculture that was pumping out more water than was going in, and it created this big surface fissure. And we can have that happen at any time in our Waco Boson area. And now to put it more in perspective, here's a view of the whole Waco Boson. Here's the airport down here in the lower left, and this is a Google Earth image. And you can faintly see some kind of lines here if you got a good enough visual on that. But what I did is I traced those lines for you to spare your eyes. These are actually surface fissures that are revealing the faults in the subsurface that we saw in the previous diagram. So we live and die by these faults. Without the faults, we couldn't have the basin, we couldn't have the underground water and the aquifers. But the more we pump the water out, the more likely these faults are going to move and cause surface rupture and damage to our infrastructure. And of course, here's Montana down here. All the faults stop right here that I traced. Well, do the faults actually stop right there? Or is that just because we've built over the faults? Our last earthquake in the area was a 2.5 right next to El Dorado High School. And so all it takes is probably, we'll start seeing some damage around 4 to 5 magnitude. If we have a 6.0 magnitude, we're pretty much every building's going to collapse, be a pile of rubble. And a 7 on what you see in California all the time, that would be very, very catastrophic. So that our water demand is actually inducing potential earthquake hazards in a catastrophic environment. So it's not just a supply issue, there's more to it. So seeing how all these factors correlate really kind of opens your eyes. So in terms of actual consumption, we got some good news and some bad news. Here's a water utilities diagram. And since the 80s, mid 80s, we have had a significant decline in per capita usage per person. Okay, we were averaging 205 gallons per person back in the mid 80s. And as of 2017, we've lowered that to 128. And the goal is to getting under 120. The problem is, if we go back to our population count is still expanding. If you take a piece of pizza, a large pizza, you can feed 5 people reasonably well with a large pizza, maybe 3, 4. But you add 20 people, that changes everything. That barely is like an appetizer, okay? So we are definitely using less per person, but part of it's because we're spreading it out over more people. So it's a conundrum that we face of using less, but are we actually using less overall? And we go to this diagram, also El Paso Water Utilities diagram, you can get off their website. Our highest demand was actually in 1994, okay? We used about 130,000 acre feet or football fields. Notice it's gone down a little bit. 2004 was the lowest since then, but then it's creeped back up because our population keeps growing. Even though our per person demand has dropped significantly, our overall demand is sustaining, and it's likely going to keep increasing. One thing I want to point out that I was referencing early, 1989, okay, that was when we used the most water from underground. 1989 was halfway through our 20-year wettest cycle on record. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is in 1989, the El Paso Water Utilities started becoming very concerned about running out of water underground during our wettest years. And so they started leaning more towards extracting from the river, which is great when the river's available, which it pretty much was, okay, up until we first started seeing some river issues here in 2002, okay? And that's when I started noticing in the 2000s how much things were drying out. Look at 2013. This is that same year, that picture diagram at Elephant Butte where the lake was practically all dry. We've had a couple good years, 2016, 2017. This doesn't even show though 2018. And last summer, July, we didn't get hardly any monsoon rain either. And the snow melt from Colorado has been lacking. So we're not really using less overall, and we're actually still having to compensate extensively with the underground water still, despite trying to use more river water. So that's the conundrum we're at in terms of overall demand. How do we try to use more river water to save the underground, but the river isn't available? So the question is, what can we do? Well, the most obvious, less demand equals more sustainability. And what I mean by that, and I have to get on my mom all the time, I hear it when I'm visiting over at her house, all of a sudden I hear the sink turn on, and I watch her walk away from the kitchen for 5 to 10 minutes and the sink's still running. And it's like, whoa, what's going on there? That water's just going down the drain. Same thing, or shower. If your shower is over 30 minutes, you're using 2 gallons per minute in your shower. That's the rate. That's with a low flow head. If you got an older head, it's even higher. I have students that I know that have taken 2 45-minute showers a day. So that's 90 minutes times 2. That's 180 gallons a day just for shower. We need to have less demand in order to save it. If everyone just took a 5-minute shorter shower, that would save 10 million gallons a day for the whole city. That would cover the loss of distributing the water, the electricity that we need to distribute the water for a typical 100 million gallon per day. So just a 5-minute shorter shower, it's not that hard. Or flip the switch off sooner, leave the lights off more, okay? Or get LED bulbs. That's one of the best things you can do. They're cheap now. I was getting them before they were even cost effective. And now I have all kinds of LED bulbs. That alone, your lighting alone covers about 10% of your energy demand. One of the most obvious though is more solar. More solar equals less water used. After it's been manufactured, there is no generator cooling required for solar like we saw in the power plant video with the steam rising up. But here's the conundrum with solar, and I've had some discussions with people on this in the past, that have a hard time grasping this, and this was a very poignant point from El Paso Electric, is to get more solar, you actually have to get more power plants that are modern. Most of their power plants are 40 to 60 years old. I have a friend that works within El Paso Electric. He keeps track of the bearing status, and it can take 3 to 5 days for these power plants to turn on or off. In other words, they cannot cycle those power plants with day or night cycles. So when you have a good sunny day, you can't reduce the amount of the power plant with the strong sun. You have to leave it running. It's like leaving your car running at full throttle, but you're not driving it because it takes too long to turn it on and off. So to get more solar, we have to modernize our power plants like they have at the Montana Power Station. They can turn off those new power plants in 10 minutes or less. So we're going to spend the money. The question is, are we going to spend it the right way or the wrong way? And they just were rejected, the power plant, the modern power plants, the natural gas ones. So we cannot get more solar until we get more modern power plants. So it's not a black and white, just get more solar, because the demand, remember, just like the water utilities company, El Paso Electric, they are meeting the demand, and the people are the demand. So until we start demanding less, will they be able to modify how they provide that power and water. Now here's a touchy one, expand nuclear power. I know everyone freaks out when they hear that. Typical nuclear is not that great. And yes, there can be some hazards to it, but I'm talking about thorium nuclear. Thorium is actually the waste of all the old nuclear waste. It actually cannot have any meltdown. It runs at much cooler temperatures, and all the nuclear waste that's been created already, we can rerun that, recycle the nuclear waste, and use much lower cost, safer power. And then you're not impacting the climate at all because there's no emissions, and then you can provide all this power with far less water use. That's a very interesting one there. You have to understand nuclear power is very different now compared to what we typically think of, especially with Chernobyl, which was never meant to be a power plant, and so on and so forth. Again, I mentioned the 10% energy efficiency. That alone saves 10 million gallons a day if the city and the whole community just improve their efficiency by 10%. Another one is expand wastewater recycling. So for example, when I take a shower and I'm waiting for the hot water to come through, I actually capture that water in a 5-gallon bucket. And then I also keep my tub water for a few days, and all that goes into my toilet. And it's odorless and it's clear. And so even our wastewater that's pretty nasty, they already treat it. We have 4 plants across the city that basically recycle 90 million gallons a day, about 96 million gallons a day. That would almost cover our whole daily need of water. And the irony is, it sounds bad, it sounds crappy to recycle our wastewater to reuse it, but it's actually already happening, because all the wastewater from Las Cruces and Albuquerque is already flowing down the Rio Grande to us, and then we're sucking it in when it's flowing and treating it and putting it back in our system. So we're actually recycling wastewater, but from Albuquerque and everywhere to the north. If we did it ourselves and we could use more solar to power that process, okay, then our sustainability factor, our underground water demands would be far less. So the bottom line is, every drop matters. How do we cherish every drop and make sure that we can ensure our water and energy future in a city that is growing like a balloon ready to pop? So we all can play a direct role in this, in how we deal with this matter.
That was amazing.
Sorry.
Yeah, go for it,
That
Cindy.
puts it into perspective, but I'm literally scratching the surface. My students spend weeks on this stuff, and this is just like a whirlwind. It's hard
I need
to,
to rewatch it.
it's hard to process it all. There's so many correlating factors, but that's the nutshell of how all these correlate.
So what about if we just get our own solar panels on our roof for our home? I mean, that's still helpful, right?
Because and I have that. I have a 3 kilowatt system, which I've calculated in my household alone in 1 year, I save about 250,000 gallons worth of water use for the community. So it comes down to your cost factor. The good thing about solar nowadays, when I started, you had to pay for it all up front. And it was typically $25,000, and you had to have all the money up front. Now it's different. You can finance it, even buy new homes with it already in. So yeah, if everyone, the best option for an individual from a financial perspective and a water saving, energy saving perspective is to get your own solar panels on your household. However, El Paso Electric has the community solar program, but it's all filled up. They had that doesn't really save you much money as a user of electricity, but it saves a lot of water for the community. But you don't have to put up that cost front.
Right. Another thing, and the master gardeners teach this, is if we do more water collection off of our roofs, I have a water barrel, and we really try to spread that word, because we don't get much rain, but if you can collect whatever rainfall comes off your roof, that's helpful too.
Oh yeah, I do that. Actually, I'm making my whole water system rain capture off my gutters. And it's because I get water trucked to me out here at Waco Tanks. Even though it sounds crazy, I have water longer than anyone else in town because I always have no less than a month's supply in my tanks available. I never use more than that. And so but I pay more per gallon, but I don't pay all the fees. So I actually pay less overall, but it's getting expensive for me. So I'm going to do all rainwater harvest. But like I said, remember I mentioned the bathtub and the shower, right? And how many people are cooking and drinking in the toilet, out of the toilet? Shouldn't be anyone, right? Maybe your dog's just getting that seasoned water. But
so are you pouring it in the actual toilet or the back part of the toilet?
Yeah, the upper part. So the funny part is in your toilet, the upper part that flushes the toilet is the exact same water you drink out of your faucet and shower in. You're using perfectly good fresh water to flush your crap down the drain.
Right.
Why would we be doing that?
It's wrong.
Gray water, right? Is that what they call it? The gray water?
Yeah, gray water.
Did you? Oh my gosh! I was just commenting in the chat that all these sessions are tying together, even with the earthship people do. They're using the water 4 to 5 times, the gray water, and they're even using the black water.
Yeah, and it's all about being aware and creative. And like my toilet, I always tell my students and everyone I encounter, the water in the toilet has the same function as the water in your blood. Because what happens if you get dehydrated? Your blood cannot flow and you cannot get the nutrients. So water is a transporter primarily, and that's what it serves in your blood. Well, that's what it's doing in the toilet.
Well, and that's what I was even talking to Cindy about during one of the Earthship, the indoor gardening sessions. She was really preaching about, she's like, I can't understand why people use perfectly good water to flush toilets. And she was like, I believe strongly in composting toilets and there's nothing wrong with them. And, but then I hear you reiterate it, and I think it's starting to sink in.
Well, think about this from the master gardener perspective of plant nutrients, okay? Fresh water from the water supply is actually the worst for plants because it has the least amount of nutrients. So all my bath water that has all my skin cells, which here's the irony, when you save your bath water, you will see all the skin that comes off of you just from one wash. But there's all kinds of bacteria and nutrients tied to that. And so when you transfer that, which we use, my daughter has her own garden that she started from scratch and everything on a pretty large scale. And actually my dean who worked at the Texas A&M Research, they compared fresh water to gray water. The gray water plants grew 7 times better.
Wow.
So
Gosh.
we already have the setup. And Albuquerque, here's the irony with Albuquerque, all their new houses, all their toilets are tied to what we call the purple pipes, which is recycled water, partially treated, not drinkable, but usable.
Yeah. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Sorry. And you just alluded to those purple pipes, partially treated water.
Yep.
Didn't El Paso have that a few years ago? Because I remember they were tearing up the sides of I-10 to get some of that set up. So I thought, yeah, I'd be willing to take the gray water for my yard and everything like that.
Well,
whatever happened? Anybody know?
They have the pipe system, but it's not elaborate enough to go to the houses because, again, there's a cost. You're creating a parallel system. You got to rebury, reconstruct, reintegrate into it. So the selling point is, yeah, it'll work great for saving our water, but then they're going to have to tell everyone you're going to have to pay much higher fees to install all this. So only the new houses is really where it's probably cost effective. But we should have been doing this 20 years ago.
True.
Look at all the construction.
I mean, you would think that people would see the bigger picture and the eventual savings and the lives it would affect and how it would help nature, but it's just always about this immediate, like, what do we deal with right now thing.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, almost my typical class size is about 25. And when I ask where our water comes from for all my students, I'm lucky if I have one person per semester out of 4 or 5 classes that has any clue. Usually it's, it comes from the faucet. Okay. How's it get to the faucet? No idea. So they go through 12 years of education and don't know where their most important resources come from. Plus, as we see, look how you cannot have any electricity without the water, and vice versa. It's tied hand in hand. You cannot have either one without each other.
See, this is why I think that we need to continue things in events like this, like the summit. And I think it needs to get bigger and bigger and bigger, because then you start getting gardeners partnering with people like you. And then they're like, oh my gosh, my garden's going to grow better. I had no idea. You know what I mean? Like, I think we can learn so much by partnering. We do have a couple questions in the chat. I don't know. Do you have a little bit more time?
Yeah, I got plenty of time.
Okay. I don't know if you've already answered some of them just in going, but how far east does the Waco, is it Bolson, extend?
Yeah, so let me see if I can go back to the picture here real quick. Oh, I'm not sharing the screen though, so let me get back to share and then see if I can give you guys a better visual. So I live out here in Waco Tanks. That's where I am right now. And I'm just east of the main boundaries of the Waco Bolson. I'm in a sub-basin called the Waco Tanks Valley. And here we go. Let me see if I can get this to come up and go back to full screen. Let's see if it comes up. So if you're driving out on Montana, and if you're aware of Red Sands area, I don't think it's coming up there.
Yeah, I think it says end of slideshow. I think you just go back a few slides maybe.
Let me see if I can at least get it on the zoom in so we don't have to.
Well, hit slideshow maybe. On your top, you're on home, maybe hit slideshow.
Yeah, so usually when I double click on that and then hit
It goes, huh?
There we go. Is that working there?
Yep.
There we go. So basically the eastern edge is roughly about Red Sands over here off Montana. And you can see on the right side of this picture, wherever you start to see dark colored material, that's the mountains. That's the eastern extent. The deepest part of the basin, though, is right along the eastern edge of the Franklin, where the old William Ballmer Hospital is now. is actually the deepest part, also the most likely to have the biggest earthquake. So all the veterans that are going to be over there, well, they might go in for treatment when the earthquake comes. might be the end of them. But all these faults, so we live and die by these faults. We can't have the water without them, but it also could be our demise. And the more we keep extracting, the more we're inducing those faults to move.
So you think you're pretty safe where you're at in Waco?
Yeah, and here's the thing is I'm in much shallower, if I show you the contrast in that early dark, I'm in a much shallower zone. So even though I have less water, so to speak, it's all good water where I'm at. And I'm over here where you can barely see the yellow sliver. Okay. William Beaumont's right here where it's at its deepest point and everything in between. The thing is, the thicker this yellow zone, when an earthquake happens, it causes what's called liquefaction. And so the more water that's in the subsurface, when the earthquake energy passes through, it turns the ground into quicksand. That's called liquefaction. Mm-hmm. It turns the solid ground, it starts to act like it's an actual body of water. And so your infrastructure, your buildings, that's part of the reason why the new William Beaumont's sinking, because it can't hold up the load.
So you're saying as a combination of our water use from the ground, in addition to just timing, that we're probably due for something sometime soon?
Very soon, any day. So I literally had a student buy earthquake insurance here in El Paso after spending 2 weeks going over all this.
Gosh.
Because like she said, well, I'd rather use the dollar, and if the earthquake comes, I'm covered. If not, I mean, because there's no earthquake codes at all in our buildings. We're not California. Mm-hmm. We're playing the odds. My house is a pre-manufactured home because it's more cost effective, but I will survive the earthquake better than any solid foundation. So here's the irony. You pay higher taxes for a solid slab foundation house, but actually the earthquake will damage those more than my house, which is on a raised foundation, because my house can slide independent of the ground by a couple inches and have minimal damage. Mm-hmm. Every solid slab house is going to be a pile of rubble.
Yeah.
If it's a 6.0 or higher.
So is that your rationale for moving out there? Have you been planning?
It kind of all works together. At first it was just, hey, I want to be out here. I want to be away from, I want to have my dirt farm, so to speak, and be able to literally go rock climbing and biking right outside my house.
Yeah.
But the shallowness of the basin and the less water and then the type of house, it's kind of like a snowball effect. Once you start going in that right direction, most of the time it works for you better, but you can go in the wrong direction too. And our misperception of houses and foundations makes us more vulnerable to damage. But if you pay for your insurance and taxes, you would think the solid slab is the only way to go.
Right. We also have a comment in the chat. Thank you for being a water saving geologist. Most of them just want to extract oil. I think it's a crime to use fresh water to flush with. Tell us more about how you do that. I think
so. I'm actually putting together a system that's more elaborate, that's tied into tanks. But right now I'm about 3/4 of the way done. But basically, I just do what anyone could do. I just use buckets, and when I fill up a 5-gallon bucket, because my water heater is 80 feet away from my main shower, I have, instead of just letting that water go down the drain while I'm waiting for it, I capture it, and then I just put that into another small bucket that is equivalent to a flush, and I literally just have the top off my toilet, and I just pour the water in every time that I need. It's pretty rudimentary, but it works. It's practical. Now you can.
Well, do you still flush with the handle, or you just pour it in the back and then it comes?
I flush with the handle, so I fill up the toilet before I even need to flush.
In the back, the back part. Okay. Fill it.
Yep. And so like a bathtub. So if you like I only take a bath a hot soaking bath to relax my muscles maybe once a week. That bathtub covers all my flushes for a whole week easily. And then I use it more. And then I take that water and capture it and put it for my trees and my garden.
Right.
My daughter puts together.
Oh my gosh, you're meant to have an Earthship.
If it wasn't for all the caliche layers that are every 6 inches to a foot out here, I would have an Earthship.
It doesn't matter. You don't have to build. You can build up. They can build anywhere.
Yeah.
They just build up instead of down.
My daughter's already designing her Earthship house in that.
Oh, cool.
Did you watch all the recordings or not yet?
I haven't got a chance to see him. Been so busy with the end of the semester here. This was perfect timing because I'm all done. But yeah, I go to Taos. I'm actually going to be in Taos tomorrow evening, and I get to see all the Earthship buildings when I drive near there.
Go stay in one. They have the Airbnb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. So like where we go rock climbing here at Waco Tanks, we have these little cave areas that we go in and out of. And when we're out there on a 100-degree day, we'll go into these cave zones and it'll be 70 degrees in there.
Yes.
You know?
It's smart.
So it's the same concept. It's really just, I think the first step for everyone is just being aware first where your water comes from, how it gets there, why it's so expensive, and it's going to continue to be more expensive. But how can you counter those factors, such as just taking water in a bucket from your shower? You can, it doesn't look fancy, but I stand up, my wife does it too, and she's a lot shorter than me. We just literally stand over a bucket while we're taking a shower, and we get 3 flushes out of that one bucket. It's not that hard. And then you can, whatever you have left over, you can use elsewhere.
I don't know, I mean, how much of an expectation I have for an answer for this question, but do some countries or even us have restrictions on what's allowable per household to control this problem, to have restrictions, or is this out of control? Like everybody can do whatever they want.
The other side of the water utilities. So here's the conundrum. There's no incentive to conserve water in terms of your water bill. You're given a block of water, like 4,000 acre feet. So that's, that's an incorrect number. It's about 700 gallons, I think, is the initial block of water, something like that. You have to look at your bill, because I'm not on El Paso Water, so I'm relying on some of my students' bills. But if you do not use that whole block of water, you still pay for it. So there's no incentive to use less. The only incentive to not use more is when you go beyond that first block of water, then you pay a much higher price for that second block. But if you're a small family or a single person or two of you, you can easily stay in that first block. But if you only use half of that block, I had one student, she was averaging half of that block, but she still had to pay for the whole block.
Got it.
So what's her incentive to use less?
Do you think they'll ever change that? Have there been talks with the concern that they might run out?
That would have to be a community effort led by leadership. You know, part of me really wants to be mayor for this one very reason, but I would be voted out in a heartbeat, because I would try and make every month we'd have to go 1 hour with no water and no electricity.
That's nothing.
I know, but you'd be surprised. Everyone would hate me, but just wake people up to look how much you depend on it.
Right.
Without the water and without the energy, you know, we need to be more like Mexico. Mexico actually has it set up good. Low water pressure, can't waste as much water because the water pressure is so poor.
Gosh.
And then if you have blackouts and stuff, well, there you go. That saves water there.
Right. There has to be incentives. No, this has given me a lot to think about. Actually, I'm really happy you presented, Rob. I started feeling so guilty during your presentation. I turned my kitchen light off, so I'm partially in the dark.
It's really
I've got a light from the window.
The theme that everyone needs to realize, it's all of us doing a little bit. It's not about a few of us doing a lot. A few of us doing a lot won't matter. That's just a drop in the bucket. Like I said, if we all just take 5-minute shorter showers, that covers our whole energy demand to get the water to us. That's as simple as it gets. You can't get any better than that.
I feel like we need a campaign.
Yeah, I'll call it save 5 minutes, something like that. Come up with a slogan, 5 minutes of less shower singing or something. Got to come up with a cool slogan that people can remember.
We have that little stinky guy from Snoopy. Is it Linus or what is his name?
Oh yeah, right.
He'll be our mascot.
More stink won't hurt you.
During COVID, we saved a lot of water.
Yeah.
Did Patricia have one more question? She said, "Can I ask a question?"
I think it's afterwards, but anything else that you want to add on recording? Anybody else? Oh my gosh, Rob, thank you so much. This is awesome. I'm so glad.
All right, well, I hope we can do this again in the future, like say in person in a conference style. So keep me on the list.
I will. Just hang back for a minute, but thank you guys for tuning in. If you have any questions, can people reach out to you if they're watching this recording later?
Yeah, you can give me my, especially my email.
You want to say it out loud and they can get a hold of you?
Yeah, so my email at EPCC, it's RROHR, B as in boy, A1 at epcc.edu.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. You're awesome. And thank you guys for tuning in. And if you have any questions, please get a hold of Rob. Thank you.
All right, take care and enjoy those shorter showers.